But it has been a very significant week in the national security and geopolitical domain. And in keeping with that, my entire program tonight will discuss security issues with two really superb guests. This week marked the 70th anniversary of the signing of the ANZUS Alliance. And on this very day in 1939, Australia declared war on Nazi Germany in response to its invasion of Poland on 1 September, thus beginning our involvement in the Great Second World War. And of course, that long war in Afghanistan finally ended with the Taliban firmly ensconced in power in Kabul, amid distressing images for both Afghan expatriates and our veterans community. My first guest tonight brings an incredibly special blend of experience to discussions of the ANZUS Alliance. Kim Beazley was respected as the Defence Minister in Bob Hawke's government. He went on to serve as Deputy Prime Minister under Paul Keating and to lead the Federal Labor Party to 2 elections. Many say he was the best Prime Minister we never had. He served later as our ambassador to the United States, so his insights into grand strategy and into the US intelligence and strategic policy communities are quite simply without peer. He's an avid, well-read historian on matters military and strategic, and he's currently the Governor of Western Australia, from where he has very kindly acceded to join us this evening. Your Excellency, welcome to the McGregor Angle.
Thank you, Catherine. It's very good to be with you again.
Welcome. You think last time was Christmas Eve and a lot of waters flowed under the bridge, sadly, without my getting across to visit you. But anyway, on to matters in hand. Kim, you've got a panoramic vision of the ANZUS Alliance, and of course, as a Western Australian and member of the Centre Unity faction, you're proudly part of the John Curtin legacy. And it was Curtin who really did unabashedly open the dialogue and turn to the United States in the darkest hours of the Second World War, wasn't it? Walk us through why Labor always felt some pride of ownership over ANZUS, even though Labor weren't in government when the treaty was concluded.
Well, basically because of what you've just said. Curtin was around and he was really our first Prime Minister to have to manage in intricate detail the character of the relationship with the relevant officials in the United States in a situation of extremity. I mean, it's always been a task of Australian leaders to be able to, in dealing with our principal allies in national security terms, to try to orient our allies into directions that we think are appropriate for ourselves and of course, we'd also think it for themselves as well. So Curtin had a really tough diplomatic job because he was dealing mainly with MacArthur, who was the head of our defence forces as well as being commander of the Southwest Pacific. And MacArthur was not all that popular in Washington. So you'd have to say that we learnt the innards of how you conduct the alliance relationship, formalised under ANZUS, basically in that period of time.
Now, this week, you must have noticed, of course, there's been some fairly predictable coverage that, you know, the US is in decline. And I know you are an incredible optimist about the United States' capacity to revitalise. Do you take the view that this is a fatal reverse and that there's an inexorable decline in the wake of this Afghanistan defeat? Or do you think the United States now can refocus on its primary strategic domain, namely the Indo-Pacific, which certainly would be in our interests?
Well, I think the latter. Look, you've got to take a careful look at the innards of these things. President Biden has never been an enthusiast for the commitment. I remember when I was ambassador to the United States, whenever there was a discussion about increasing this or that activity associated with Afghanistan, particularly any raising of troop numbers, Biden was always almost the only holdout saying, no, don't do this. I had a bit of a feeling that having reversed all of Trump's policy, he might choose to reverse this aspect of it. But when you've got a situation when he came into office, Trump had effectively, via his Secretary of State, negotiated a withdrawal without consulting the Afghan government, I might say, with the Taliban leadership. The chances of Joe Biden actually overturning that were somewhere between Buckley's and none. So from Biden's point of view, this is simply a decision they've taken in American strategic interests. To many of the rest of it, it looks simply horrible for the people of Afghanistan. But to him, and he's been pretty robust in defence of what he's been doing, this is not American core interest. What you have described, he describes as American core interest.
And indeed, I think, as a foreign policy realist, and we'd both agree on this, in a way, the blessing in disguise here is that the United States can reconfigure its conventional forces for maritime tasks in our most vital region, our sea lines of communication. Kim, explain to Australians, I think there's a sense that we always provide contingents for wars that are not really our business, and there's a misunderstanding of just how indispensable Australia is to the US. It's often seen that we ride on their coattails, but without going into anything that we can't talk about, we are the indispensable power as well, aren't we, because of the geospatial positioning of both Pine Gap and the network of ground stations we host. Walk us through some of the aspects of Australia's intelligence sharing and capabilities, particularly in submarine warfare, that are vital to the US.
Look, we're critical for each other. That's the truth of the matter. We could not defend ourselves or even contemplate the possibility of a defence of our continent if we weren't receiving from the Americans the intelligence, the equipment, participating in the joint scientific defence endeavours that we do, and with the threat ultimately of American engagement hanging over any of the conflicts that we might find ourselves in. Australians don't live with that. Australian defence ministers and ambassadors do, because we know what those facilities do, and when we host the largest American intelligence gathering base in the world, and that includes continental United States in Pine Gap, we have a thoroughgoing comprehension of how important we are and how important they are to us. Because what has happened since the 1980s, when I was Defence Minister, is that those bases, the joint facilities, including the new ones related to space here in Western Australia, are bound into our Defence Force structure. They're not just part of the American Defence Force structure, they're ours. And we could not afford to replace them, and without them we'd be blind and deaf. So it's a good thing that the United States is now focused on the sort of equipment and strategies that are important to us and the way we see the world in a maritime defence, all those things which you in fact pointed to. I don't believe, however, that Afghanistan has left us behind. You know, Nietzsche once said, when you stare into the abyss stares ultimately into you. And the abyss for us to stare into has always been the Middle East, and now it's staring into us. You can't just walk out of a place like Afghanistan and not have some residual impact on yourselves, and particularly on your conscience, in related to what you see with people who have helped you and what's happening to people on the ground anyway. Already, the Taliban are presiding over a failed state, and that has all sorts of implications.
Indeed. I guess it's timely reflecting on that withdrawal from Afghanistan, and you inherited a defence force that was essentially a legacy force from the Vietnam War, and I know the events of recent weeks have opened up some old wounds amongst a lot of the Vietnam guys. I've been talking to a lot of them. Your theory and the DIB review and the force structure and priorities that you as Defence Minister reset have aged pretty well, haven't they? In that on July 1 last year, the current government pretty much adopted what was Beazley 2.0 without being too flattering, but you must be reasonably comfortable with the nature of the strike capability enhancements that you would have seen announced last year.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think there's one big difference between where we are now and where I was when I was Defence Minister. when Paul Dibb and myself were redoing the structure, that self-reliance within alliances as the basic general strategy, which was not our general strategy. It was actually Malcolm Fraser's in the 76 White Paper, but it had no meat on it. It got meat in 1987. I could say, you know, as I went to bed every night, that what we've identified as the potential principal threat, which we then called extended low-level threats, augmented low-level threats, you could deal with what we called the force in being. Now, we thought that the sort of major league confrontation that we could contemplate was 10 or 15 years down the track. Well, we're a bit out. It was 30 years down the track. But nevertheless, it's now arrived. We don't have any warning time. So we need items of equipment that are very significant and sophisticated. But actually, we need the stuff to be capable of fighting a war. Now, when you look at that, what you're looking at are things like fuel reserves, ammunition reserves, missile stocks, spare parts, hardening of bases, spreading of bases. Actually, there is very little around that looks at that. There's a lot around that's going to come in over a lengthy period of time, but we need also to be looking at that. I do think that the government and the defence planners sort of understand that. And they're very proud of the fact that they now exceed about 2% of GDP on defence. Well, when we last faced what you might call an existential threat, when John Curtin was Prime Minister, we were spending 32% of our GDP on defence. So it's we are a long, long way from home.
Yeah, and no, that's a very sobering thought, Kim. I guess I know over many discussions you're somewhat of a pessimist about global affairs and a realist. In the brief time remaining to us, are you pessimistic about the future? Do you think, is there a degree of inevitability about a cross-straits operation against Taiwan, or do you think the US shift to the Indo-Pacific can form a deterrent and avoid a conflagration in which we're inextricably involved?
What is the deterrent requires a lot more thought. What would actually deter that activity? That's something which we do talk about with the Americans. We have to talk about it. We have to talk about deterrence in relation to ourselves. I mean, it's the oldest adage. The Romans developed it, and that is, if you want to have peace, prepare for war. And we need to have a situation which convinces the Chinese that they don't actually have an interest in doing anything about it. I think the Chinese got a very great domestic preoccupation. I must say, my own thinking has swung around to and fro on this one, somewhat whipsawed. A few months ago, if you're having this conversation, I'd say we were on the verge in relation to the Taiwan Straits. Now I'm not so sure. There seems to be much more of a domestic concentration by President Xi at the moment. So I think that probably one thing Xi would know is that if anything on the Taiwan Straits went pear-shaped, you could not rule out anything, including a nuclear exchange. And what you could rule in would be economic devastation for the globe and for China. So there's a lot out there to deter, but deterrence also relies on a convincing military capability.
And you were instrumental in laying the foundations of that very capability. Kim Beazley, as always, a pleasure to chat with you, and I hope we can do so again after Tony Dell launches his book. All the very best to you, and I'll send a shout out to 2 Squadron SASR on your behalf tonight.